I'm keeping you, for as long as you'll let me, he whispered with blood on his hands. When Emma walked into a private mafia office at midnight, she ignited a devastating gang war. The only price for peace. A forced wedding to the most terrifying man in the city. With her mother held hostage and a ticking clock of 48 hours, she had to choose between survival and the mafia king. Wait until you hear what she said at the altar. Let us open this clinical file together and examine the exact moment the trauma bond takes root. High above the wet Chicago streets, our subject Emma experiences complete nervous system collapse. Pinned against a mahogany desk, her pulse thrashes violently. Looming over her is Dante Moretti, a megalomaniacal narcissist wearing fresh blood on his collar. Under extreme psychological duress, her mind fractures into infantile regression. She confesses her deepest secret: she has never been kissed. The apex predator freezes. He traces her pale cheek with a calculated, possessive smile. It presents a fascinating behavioral paradox for us to study. Sometimes, the raw vulnerability we desperately try to hide away becomes the exact psychological armor that keeps us alive in the presence of a killer. To understand this pathology, we must review the environmental precursors. Emma entered that towering mafia stronghold with exactly $12 to her name. It was nearly midnight on a miserable Tuesday. Every evolutionary survival instinct screamed at her to abandon the catering invoice and flee into the fog. However, financial deprivation creates a profound vulnerability. Her employer had spent the week systematically breaking her down with threats of termination. Operating on the fumes of severe sleep deprivation, her executive functioning completely failed. Desperation is a remarkably tragic compass in the human brain. We must never allow an abusive authority figure to push us into compromising our physical safety. Chronic exhaustion simply strips away our cognitive defenses, marching us blindly into the darkest cages. Blinded by systemic fatigue, she steps into the private elevator, ascending into the isolation zone of the predator. The penthouse level possesses a suffocating quiet that naturally triggers the human amygdala to panic. Yet, Emma moves forward. Her psychological profile is shaped by the persistent trauma of poverty, a terror that completely overrides her natural fear of the dark. She knocks on the massive oak door, listening to her own frantic tachycardia, and pushes it open. Her voice is fragile in the cavernous space. The room is freezing, framing the city like jagged glass. Hear this vital neurological truth. When your primitive instincts scream that an environment is lethal, you must listen. Never let the anxiety of poverty drag you into a violent man's domain. The office is saturated with the scent of aged cedar and expensive leather, olfactory markers of extreme dominance. Waiting silently in the ink-black shadows behind the desk sits Dante. The oxygen completely leaves Emma's lungs. The harsh moonlight hits his sharp jawline, revealing the physical geometry of a violent offender. His dark eyes lock onto her trembling frame, tracking her micro-expressions with the hypervigilance of an apex predator. Her fingers shake violently as she chokes out a whispered apology. You and I must recognize the profound psychological lesson here. An elegant suit is simply the ultimate sociopathic mask. Immense wealth does not ever negate a man's capacity for absolute evil. We must always scrutinize the monster hiding in the dark. She stammers helplessly into the dark, projecting complete submission. Clinging to her invoice like a physical barrier, she whispers that the door was cracked. Dante shatters her defense mechanism with two chilling words: "Come here." It is the modulated command of a megalomaniac who never encounters resistance. Her autonomic nervous system betrays her, carrying her closer to his desk. He leans forward, pinning her with a sociopathic stare. "You made the pastries," he murmurs. She enters a state of tonic immobility. As the lamp catches his face, she finally registers the fresh arterial blood soaking his collar. Consider this behavioral truth. Even in a pathological underworld built on violence, demonstrating absolute mastery over your craft commands the respect of the most dangerous men. Let us observe his severe cognitive dissonance. Fresh blood stains his white cotton. Yet Dante completely compartmentalizes his recent violence, smoothly declaring her work the greatest he has ever tasted. Emma initiates a flight response, stepping backward. His voice drops to a lethal frequency. "Sit down," he commands. The auditory force of his dominance shatters her motor control, dropping her into the chair, the isolated room, the blood. His predatory fixation, it induces acute psychological shock. Then comes the fatal question. "Are you afraid of me?" Her instinct begs her to mask her terror. But heed this clinical warning. When staring into the eyes of a true psychopath, deception is a fatal error. A seasoned predator will always detect your rising cortisol. Yes, she breathes, the involuntary truth escaping her compromised vocal cords. Dante's mouth tips into a devastating smirk. It is a clear micro-expression of narcissistic supply, showing how he bends human will. Good, he whispers. He promises he will never harm her, a classic manipulation tactic from a man painted in blood. Maintaining hypnotic eye contact, he writes a staggering figure on a check and pushes it across the desk. Emma stares at the paper, her respiratory system seizing. It is 3 times her wage. She gasps that it is too much, but he rises, revealing a physique built for violence. We must learn from her impending tragedy. Recognize your intrinsic value, but fundamentally understand that accepting a sociopath's resources permanently wires you into his web of control. Let us examine the spatial dynamics of this tension. It is the dead of night, and our subject stands frozen in the aggressor's territory. Dante analyzes her respiratory rate, calculating whether she possesses anomalous courage or a fatal cognitive impairment. I am terrified, she whispers. He stalks around the desk, invading her personal perimeter until he eclipses her entirely. This should trigger absolute panic, but tragically, the initial stages of Stockholm Syndrome begin to manifest. He introduces the behavioral hook, have dinner with me. Her reality fractures as he dictates the terms for tomorrow. Human psychology operates on a dark logic. Sometimes, surrendering directly to the predator that terrifies you. Most is the exact mechanism the brain uses to forge a new identity. Emma exhibits a flinch response, deploying logic to remind him she is a stranger. Dante stares right through her cognitive armor. He notes she recognizes his antisocial profile, yet has not initiated flight. Clinging to her reality, she stammers out Mr. Moretti. He dismantles that boundary instantly. Say my name, he demands. When she finally breathes the word Dante, his pupils dilate with a dark chemical reward. Good girl, he murmurs. An auditory trigger that bypasses her rational brain. He presses a black card into her hand. When she cites her employment obligations, he casually offers to buy out her schedule. Take note of this psychological fact. When a dominant narcissist truly covets your presence, they will systematically bankrupt your entire world just to secure your absolute isolation. Let us examine this clinical escalation together. Dante studies her with the terrifying patience of a predator who knows the psychological containment is complete. He softly predicts she will say yes. Every alarm in Emma's prefrontal cortex screams, urging her to escape. Yet she whispers okay. It is a textbook trauma response. Dante rewards her compliance with a ruinous smile, instructing her to go home, secure her perimeter, and stay quiet. Hours later, her circadian rhythm is completely shattered. She stares at the ceiling, his visual imprint burned into her neural pathways. This reveals a terrifying vulnerability in human neurobiology. Sometimes your subconscious drives will pull you directly into a violent man's orbit, utterly overriding the fundamental logic that begs you to survive. This is the precise moment her moral baseline degrades. Emma paces, obsessively recalling the blood he wore like a territorial marker. At 2:47 in the morning, a text pierces the dark, asking if her deadbolts are engaged. Adrenaline floods her system. He has acquired her private data. A stable subject would contact law enforcement, but our compromised heroine? She types a single submissive yes. His response delivers a massive dopamine hit. Good girl, now go to sleep. She lies back with severe muscle tremors, yet a pathological smile forms because her captor just provided praise. Validation is an incredibly addictive neurotoxin. Sourcing your psychological worth from a violent offender is the absolute fastest blueprint for orchestrating your own demise. She experiences physical collapse as morning light breaches her apartment. The day becomes a state of severe dissociation. She moves through her shift completely depersonalized. Her supervisor detects her flattened affect, asking if she suffered a trauma. Emma suppresses the truth, blaming her autonomic tremors on insomnia. What alternative narrative could she offer? That she is the new hyperfixation of a pathological executioner. The physiological cost is written directly on her skin. A catastrophic secret will always metabolize into your biology, making it impossible to conceal behind a socially acceptable smile. At exactly 6 in the evening, her device vibrates. The clinical countdown to her total psychological assimilation has commenced, and the prognosis is terminal. The cold light of a cracked phone illuminated Emma's exhausted features. The text message she received was a masterclass in coercive control. It read, "The car arrives at 7:30. Wear something nice." She froze in her greasy diner uniform, the scent of fry oil clinging to her like a psychological weight. Her closet offered only worn threads, utterly useless for a billionaire's dark reality. Then, A sharp knock shattered her isolation. A rigidly polished woman stood in the dim hallway, clutching 3 designer garment bags, clinically announcing that Mr. Moretti sent her. You and I must recognize how poverty paralyzes a desperate mind. But the chilling truth is this. Immense wealth operates as a tactical weapon, erasing an entire crisis before the victim even realizes they have been bought. Sophia bypassed Emma's boundaries with the chilling efficiency of a cartel enforcer. Tossing the bags onto a frayed quilt, she clinically declared they had 45 minutes to execute a miracle. She weaponized that water-damaged bathroom, converting it into a high-society staging ground. When Emma finally stood before the cracked glass, her respiration stopped. A flawless emerald dress wrapped her in cold silk worth more than her vehicle. She appeared fully exposed, yet undeniably dangerous. From a behavioral standpoint, stepping into a fabricated skin triggers a violent psychological shift. The lesson here is, well, it is quite simple. Sometimes, wearing a bold new version of yourself is the exact catalyst required to unlock the dormant power you carried all along. Emma presented as an absolute vision, her gaze carrying a dark, adaptive weight. She had successfully compartmentalized her waitress identity, adopting the armor necessary to survive a criminal underworld. A black sedan transported her through a rainy blur of neon lights. Inside the restaurant, the hostess delivered a brutally clinical stare, silently calculating Emma's social value. Then the shadows parted. Subject Dante materialized. He wore a sharp black suit, projecting the devastating, megalomaniacal aura of an apex predator who personally authored the rules of sin. Society will constantly attempt to profile you based on your exterior. But remember this reality. It is the raw, unapologetic energy you project from within that eventually forces a hostile room to submit. Dante moved through the room, like drifting smoke, an aesthetic of dark wool wrapping blunt violence. Patrons exhibited submissive behavior, tracking his every move. Yet the crime boss kept his visual anchor locked solely on Emma. Reaching out, his thumbs slowly traced the bones of her knuckles, executing a classic dominance display. He flashed a predatory smile, whispering that he always knew she would choose the green fabric. He wore his pathological arrogance like a heavy iron crown, guiding her toward an isolated back room. Let us analyze this together. When a manipulator offers you the illusion of choice, yet already knows exactly what you will pick, they are paying profound, terrifying attention to your psychological baseline. The psychological pressure inside that secluded room was suffocating. Emma exhibited visible tremors as Dante pulled out her chair, softly instructing her to relax. Her fight-or-flight response completely misfired. She blurted out that the streets claimed otherwise, bracing herself for a violent reaction. Instead, a dark laugh rumbled from his chest. Leaning across the table, his tone dropped into a chilling register. He clinically admitted to orchestrating unspeakable violence, rationalizing that he would repeat every sociopathic act to protect his bloodline. He noted she was the only one who viewed him as a man, rather than a monster. The behavioral lesson here is clear. The greatest gift you can offer a deeply broken psyche is simply treating them like a normal human being. He held her under a gaze that had witnessed too many shallow graves, confessing how rare it was to be perceived as human. Leaning back, he demanded her history. Men with his dark triad traits do not tolerate silence, so Emma let her defensive barriers collapse. She detailed surviving brutal double shifts and wiring money to an emotionally absent mother. She exposed the crushing trauma of her financial debt, and the terrifying kingpin just listened. He anchored his dark eyes to hers, using highly focused attention to make her feel as though the outside world had ceased to exist. This is the seed of traumatic bonding. The lesson is profound. True emotional leverage is never purchased with money. It is earned by giving someone your undivided, hypnotic attention. As her narrative concluded, Dante deployed a classic psychological mirror, telling her she was blind to the raw resilience vibrating inside her. Emma attempted a self-deprecating laugh, but he sharply cut her off. He clinically noted that the heirs in his syndicate inherited their power, while she waged a desperate war just to breathe. He framed her survival instinct as making her deadlier than any pampered mob prince. Before that cognitive reframe could take hold, his phone violently shattered the quiet. The calculated intimacy evaporated, his eyes instantly iced over, the ruthless megalomaniac snapping back into his tailored skin. Remember this reality. True psychological strength is never cultivated in a sterile environment. It is forged in the relentless fire of everyday survival. The pressure in the room utterly collapsed. Dante began pacing, firing vicious Italian directives into his phone. Emma could only decode fragments, but the behavioral cues of spilled blood and severe betrayal were unmistakable. The highly attentive man who had just validated her trauma vanished, replaced by a sociopath. He snapped the device shut, strictly ordering his enforcer to escort her home. Crossing the floor, he framed her face with both hands, his voice dropping into a lethal command. Lock your doors and do not open them for a single living soul. As an analyst, I can tell you that ignoring a predator's warning is a fatal cognitive error. When the darkness tells you to throw the deadbolt and hide from an incoming storm, you do not analyze it, you simply survive. He planted a frantic kiss on her forehead and evaporated, leaving only the scent of cordite. Emma was completely dysregulated. She endured the transit home in a dissociative daze, collapsing onto her bed still encased in expensive silk. At 3:17 in the morning, her phone sliced through the dark. He verified her locks were turned. She confirmed, and he issued a calculated apology. When she asked if he was okay, he delivered a brutally honest no. Displaying early signs of Stockholm Syndrome, she prioritized his well-being, asking if he was at least safe. The ensuing digital silence was psychologically agonizing. We all must learn this clinical truth. Investing your deepest empathy in a highly dangerous individual is the absolute destruction of your own mental peace. The screen's glare illuminated the dark when his text finally materialized. He ordered her to detach, claiming he was a ruined man not worth her distress. But Emma's trauma bond was already cemented. She typed back with irrational conviction, actively dismantling the wall he pretended to build. His surrender was a calculated breadcrumb. He replied, "Go to sleep, sweetheart. We will face the dawn together." The dawn, however, manifested as pure environmental chaos. At 7 in the morning, aggressive banging assaulted her door. Through the peephole, she observed an elegant woman with a sociopathic glare, coldly demanding to discuss her brother. Listen to this clinical truth. When you consciously ignore the psychological sirens in the dark, you guarantee a violent collision by sunrise. Emma forced her vocal cords to function, questioning the hostile stranger's identity. The woman offered a predatory smile, introducing herself as Gabriella Moretti, sister of the psychopath himself. She clinically announced they had a monumental variable to resolve. When Emma deployed a defense mechanism of ignorance, Gabriella verbally dismantled it. She rapidly listed Dante's anomalous tactical deviations. The emerald dress, the isolated table, the fact that he halted his operations simply to observe her talk. For 15 years, the kingpin functioned as an unfeeling machine, yet now he was paralyzed, waiting for her messages. Let us examine this anomaly together. When an apex predator drops his entire empire just to occupy your orbit, his psychological fixation is absolute. Emma stumbled over her defense, swearing she lacked the capacity to orchestrate such chaos. Gabriella remained immune to her distress, threatening to breach the door if she did not comply. Experiencing severe panic, Emma surrendered and slid the chain away. The sister invaded the apartment, her evaluative gaze instantly cataloging the poverty of the room. She demanded a concrete timeline of Emma's relationship with the syndicate boss. When Emma whispered it had been exactly 72 hours, Gabriella suffered a visible cognitive short-circuit. A pathology frozen for a decade completely destabilized in 3 days. Listen to me closely. The most profound psychological enmeshments do not require years of exposure. They can violently fuse together in a single catastrophic heartbeat. Looking at the psychological baseline of this encounter, we see a textbook high-stress integration. Gabriella uses violent verbal conditioning, promising a shallow grave to trigger a severe panic response. In these criminal ecosystems, the only exit is fatal. But the human brain reacts unpredictably to terror. Instead of breaking, Emma exhibits acute defensive rigidity. She stiffens, maintaining eye contact to swear her innocence. Gabriella counters by framing her brother Dante as a vector of absolute destruction, actively mocking the frayed cushions of Emma's cheap apartment. Then, a ringing phone shatters the clinical baseline. The lesson here is incredibly simple. Do not swim in pitch-black water if you are completely unprepared for the apex predators waiting below. Let us unpack this behavioral shift together, you and I. Both subjects freeze as the screen illuminates. Dante's name flashes like a warning siren. Gabriella forces Emma to answer on speaker, initiating a dangerous triangulation dynamic. Emma suffers visible motor tremors. The phone slipping in her hands, Dante's voice erupts from the speaker, radiating sheer, unmedicated rage. Gabriella snatches the device, screaming that she is protecting this girl from his toxic pathology. Dante responds with a primal roar that makes Emma physically recoil, ordering his sister out immediately. The heavy door slams hard enough to rattle the walls. The lesson is stark. Never position yourself between family members whose only emotional currency is generational violence. The latch clicks, and Dante instantly shifts tactics. The narcissist drops his aggression, adopting a hollow whisper to ask if she is physically harmed. It is a textbook tactic to foster dependency. Emma collapses onto the sofa, her adrenaline crashing. She asks him to define this deadly psychological dance. He claims he cannot walk away, operating on pure obsession. When Emma repeats his sister's warning, Dante uses weaponized vulnerability. He agrees, labeling himself a fire that leaves only ash, insisting she deserves the sun. Emma exhibits early trauma bonding, asking what happens if she actively rejects the sun. The lesson is vital. When a severely damaged personality tells you they bring ruin, believe them the very first time. Observe the contradiction in his speech patterns. Dante calls her a fool, but the tone registers as desperate warmth. He then projects that foolishness onto himself, claiming he is trapped in an orbit he cannot break. Bypassing her protests, he asserts dominance, stating armed guards now surround her building. He frames this extreme surveillance as safety before disconnecting. Left in the quiet, Emma stares at the peeling paint. 2 days ago, her primary stressor was poverty. Now, she is caught in the psychological gravity of a violent kingpin. Her rational brain screams to flee. Then, the screen lights up. He offers dinner to soothe her heightened nervous system. The lesson is proven. The dark thrill of chaos is often far more intoxicating than a safe, invisible existence. Stick with me, because this is the exact moment the psychological dam breaks. Emma exhales a shaky breath, suppresses her baseline survival instincts, and actively invites her captor to her door. The clinical lesson here is fascinating. The greatest danger to the human spirit is often rotting away in a miserable comfort zone. By 7 o'clock, the kingpin arrives. His tailored corporate armor is gone. He stands in the hallway wearing dark denim and a black shirt, a weathered jacket gripped in his fist. Stripped of his formal camouflage, his predatory nature is entirely exposed. He smells of rain and terrible behavioral choices. Emma loses her ability to speak as her pulse hammers against her ribs. With a terrifyingly soft effect, he simply asks if she is ready for the ride. We watch Emma step over the threshold, officially crossing into his reality. Basic logic dictates she should be paralyzed, but here is a profound truth we see in behavioral science. Courage is rarely the absence of fear. It is simply human curiosity whispering just a fraction louder than panic. Down at the curb, a black sedan waits. Dante opens her door, but once behind the wheel, he hesitates. He grips the leather until his knuckles turn white, exhibiting the physical tension of a man warring against his own violent pathology. He finally speaks, swearing his sister only meant to protect her. When Emma softly asks who the real threat is, Dante turns. His heavy, unblinking stare perfectly illustrates a dominant predator, silently evaluating his willing prey. Staring into the dark, Dante utilizes psychological idealization, confessing she is the most innocent soul he has ever met. Emma challenges this cognitive dissonance, demanding to know why his syndicate treats her like a loaded weapon. The narcissist lets his armor crack. She is a massive threat, he admits, just not the kind that fires bullets. The lesson is clinically clear. The individuals who permanently derail our lives are often those offering a quiet place to rest. Dante bridges the physical space, his scarred knuckles grazing her hand. He admits her presence triggers a craving for an ordinary peace that contradicts his violent reality. Emma stops breathing entirely. The terrifying architect of the underworld is sitting in the shadows, silently begging for clean hands. The engine roars to life, breaking the fragile, intimate conditioning. Emma studies his profile, bluntly asking for his true psychological classification. Dante does not flinch. He clinically categorizes himself as a monster possessing a bizarre weakness for bakery sweets. The calculated honesty in this self-assessment is striking. The life lesson is universal. Looking the darkest parts of your own pathology in the eye is the only way to heal, even if you wear a criminal crown. Emma attempts to probe further, but the aggressive flex of his jaw silences her. They drive deep into a decaying industrial graveyard of rotting concrete. Acute panic tightens Emma's throat, yet Dante glances over, projecting total environmental control, swearing she is completely untouchable in his presence. We follow the subjects into a freezing, abandoned alleyway. Emma's nervous system tenses, fully bracing for a trauma event, but keep this behavioral reality in mind. The universe loves irony, frequently hiding its most profound magic behind the most terrifying doors. Dante approaches a massive steel slab, rapping a code against the cold metal. Inside, heavy deadbolts grind open. The silence is shattered by the wail of a live saxophone. The rotting exterior was a calculated psychological deterrent. Inside is a spectacular sanctuary ripped straight from a prohibition fever dream. Blood-red velvet booths, a thick haze of sweet cigar smoke, a polished mahogany bar funded by illicit capital. Emma stands paralyzed, her sensory processors totally overloaded by the violent elegance. Dante leans close, his deep voice vibrating beneath the jazz, framing this space as a psychological safe room. Analyze his spatial body language. He refuses to sit across from her. Instead, he slides into the booth directly beside her. Using physical proximity to establish dominance, an older waitress approaches, playfully patting the shoulder of this lethal megalomaniac as if he were family. We all recognize this life lesson. The true measure of a person's empathy is how kindly they treat the working class. Dante offers a genuine smile, ordering 2 drinks. Left to process her frayed nerves in the amber lighting, Emma studies his stoic profile. Pushing through her developing trauma bond, she quietly asks how much of the city he truly commands. Dante drapes his arm across the velvet, his hand ghosting her shoulder in a classic territorial display. He clinically questions if she is psychologically prepared for his answer. Emma offers a frail nod. Instantly, the fabricated romantic tension dissolves, replaced by the icy affect of an apex predator. He details the legitimate fronts first: real estate and shipping yards. But remember this fundamental life lesson. The most secure fortresses are always cemented with the darkest mud. Dropping his voice, he confesses the brutal machinery turning the gears, the organized extortion, the physical trauma inflicted for unpaid debts. His father engineered this blood-soaked dynasty using blunt force. When the patriarch died, Dante inherited a generational psychological nightmare he never wanted. We have reached the emotional peak of this clinical case, you and I. Dante articulates the crushing weight of his existence. Imagine a young mind forced to act as the sole barrier against absolute slaughter. He admits to ordering extreme violence, rationalizing that this blood keeps his family alive. Here is a devastating life lesson. Leadership is a crown woven of thorns, and stepping into the dark is often the only way to protect your people. Emma tests his empathy, asking if the moral rot eats at his soul. The megalomaniac's stoic mask fractures. He admits to waking up suffocating in night terrors. With haunted eyes, he begs her to run. But Emma's trauma bond is rapidly cementing. She plants her feet, refusing to retreat. Dante simply stares, entirely consumed by a tragic, impossible psychological hunger. Let us examine the physiological shift here. The subject, Dante, utilizes somatic anchoring, a thumb tracing her lip to assert dominance while feigning vulnerability. A textbook megalomaniac narcissist. He openly admits to bearing men who trigger this perceived weakness, effectively using terror to bond his victim. He claims she deserves a gentle romance, a calculated cognitive dissonance. But Emma's limbic system is already compromised. By closing the gap and initiating the kiss, she demonstrates the genesis of Stockholm Syndrome, aggressively bonding with her captor to neutralize the threat. You and I must recognize this psychological inevitability. Sometimes, the human mind will fully surrender to a dangerous predator, simply because the illusion of control feels safer than the unknown. Observe his immediate physiological reaction. For a microsecond, Dante experiences a catastrophic failure of his defensive architecture. He pulls her with the frantic, deregulated hunger of a man whose narcissistic supply has been suddenly starved. Emma grips his clothing, cementing her trauma bond, clinging to the exact source of her emotional destabilization. It is a profound paradox we often see in the clinical field. Letting go of our rigid survival mechanisms can simulate the intoxicating rush of truly feeling alive, even if it is lethal. When they detach, his pupils dilate with adrenaline and primal hunger, yet his pathology instantly reasserts itself. The emotional vault slams shut, and he brutally labels the interaction a mistake, punishing her for his momentary lapse. The environment mirrors the sudden plunge in psychological temperature. Emma exhibits a classic freeze response, utterly paralyzed by the violent whiplash of his emotional withdrawal. Dante projects his own internal agony onto her, confessing his addiction to her presence while simultaneously enforcing a punishing physical distance. He dictates that he must remove her from the premises before his impulse control shatters. In our clinical assessments, we often find that erecting impenetrable boundaries is a painful necessity for a fractured psyche, as those rigid lines prevent total psychological collapse. Emma suppresses her natural urge to protest, swallowing her ego in the face of his visible instability. Their subsequent transit is clinically suffocating, heavily saturated with unspoken trauma. The clinical observation here requires us to focus on his motor functions. Dante leaves the vehicle running, his knuckles drained of blood as he grips the steering wheel, a severe manifestation of acute psychological stress. He delivers the calculated mandate that he will vanish for several days to engage in the syndicate's violent operations. This illustrates a severe, inescapable behavioral loop. A damaged individual can never outrun the gravity of their own malignant history, regardless of their evasive maneuvers. He assigns his enforcer, Marco, to monitor her coordinates relentlessly. Note the pathological irony of his condition. The megalomaniac narcissist isolates and effectively incarcerates the only untainted variable in his ecosystem, systematically traumatizing himself to protect her. Let us examine the immediate aftermath of the separation. Emma flees into her domicile, her sympathetic nervous system entirely hijacked as she throws the deadbolt and struggles for oxygen. She attempts to cognitively restructure her timeline, bargaining for 3 days of baseline neutrality. However, environmental stressors rarely respect our coping mechanisms. A mere 18 hours later, her fragile psychological sanctuary implodes. Inside her workplace, a distressed coworker triggers the alarm. Marco is positioned outside, blatantly exhibiting lethal weaponry. Emma confronts the enforcer, her nervous system bracing for impact. The diagnostic reality here is incredibly stark. You can temporarily disassociate from danger, but you can never sever yourself from the catastrophic consequences. The ambient anxiety in the room reaches a critical threshold. Bystanders exhibit clear avoidance behaviors, their eyes averted in a collective submission to the alpha threat. Emma, experiencing acute cold sweats, demands a situational assessment. Marco offers zero psychological cushioning. With flat, sociopathic affect, he informs her she has been tracked by hostile operatives. We can literally observe the vasovagal syncope, threatening to drop her blood pressure as she pales. Marco bypasses her consent entirely, initiating a forced extraction to a secure facility. When she attempts a reality-denying protest about her employment, he neutralizes it instantly, revealing she is now collateral leverage. The clinical takeaway is absolute. When systemic violence breaches your perimeter, adapt instantly. In this pathological ecosystem, opposing factions recognize Emma as his critical weakness, a vulnerable extension of the megalomaniac himself. She is reduced to organic bait. Her fine motor skills disintegrate, leaving her hands trembling uncontrollably in a textbook neurogenic tremor. Her colleague essentially begs her to prioritize basic survival. Marco physically overriding her autonomy is necessary here. He grips her arm, thrusting her into a fortified vehicle occupied by another desensitized combatant. The subsequent extraction is a severe sensory overload of centrifugal force and urban evasion. You and I must understand the neurobiology of these moments. When an individual is swallowed by complete external chaos, the only viable survival strategy is to submit to the protective protocol. The subject remains hyper-focused on tactile anchoring, her knuckles drained of color, as the external environment smears into a dissociative blur. The extraction terminates at a high-altitude fortified structure. Under baseline conditions, this penthouse would register as an architectural marvel of glass and acoustic isolation. Yet, the human brain cannot process opulence when the amygdala is flooded with lethal terror. Emma is visibly struggling with respiratory regulation. Marco delivers a sterile briefing on the perimeter defenses, assuring her that Dante is currently neutralizing the hostile variables. His micro-expressions indicate severe, impending violence. It underscores a fundamental psychiatric truth. Accumulating endless resources cannot generate internal regulation when threatened. You and I are fully aware of what threat neutralization entails for a man of his psychological profile. Dante is currently engaged in predatory, antisocial violence to eradicate the encroaching elements. Inside the containment zone, Emma collapses, her musculature failing as the synthetic adrenaline recedes. Marco introduces an isolation mechanism, a localized communication device programmed with a single contact point. By prohibiting external communication, he officially severs her from the stabilizing civilian world. Left in the sensory deprivation of this elevated cage, her mind actively visualizes the atrocities Dante is committing on her behalf. Eventually, the compulsion to connect overrides her hesitation. She initiates contact. Deep pathological attachment guarantees an intercepted signal. The auditory feed connects them, his vocal cords generating a dysregulated frequency that treats her name as a desperate psychological tether. Emma experiences an immediate emotional purge, weeping into the receiver. Dante exhibits profound cognitive dissonance. He issues a raw, seemingly authentic apology for contaminating her life, even as the horrific, Visceral screams of a man being tortured bleed through the audio background. His pathology instantly pivots to command structure, ordering her away from exposed sightlines. When she demands data, he simply promises to incinerate the entire social order to guarantee her biological safety. Her worst fears are validated. Yet the trauma bond deepens. The behavioral equation is unyielding. When you align with a volatile entity, prepare for the fallout. The sudden termination of the call leaves her entirely unmoored in a cavernous space. Emma tightens her grip on the device, falling into a severe ruminative loop. She attempts to intellectually process the sheer velocity of a sociopath executing his violent imperatives. The psychological weight of their singular, physical interaction crushes her. Was that sudden fusion of their boundaries the catalyst for this systemic collapse? Time distorts, stretching into a sensory-deprived agony. She exhibits the pacing behaviors of a captive organism. Eventually, as the diurnal cycle shifts into deep, saturated reds, a conscious rebellion occurs. Defying his strict parameters, she slowly drifts toward the exposed perimeter of the glass. Prolonged emotional isolation frequently compels us to court hazard. Following 72 hours of sustained hyperarousal, the environment produces an auditory trigger. Emma's autonomic nervous system floods with cortisol. She secures a dense, improvised blunt instrument. Her motor cortex fully prepared to engage in lethal survival. The barrier retracts, revealing Dante. The initial dopamine spike of relief is instantly corrupted by his physical presentation. He displays the flattened affect of a seasoned killer, his dermis lacerated, depositing biological evidence across the sterile flooring. He ignores her verbal check, smoothly penetrating her defensive space to disarm her trembling hands before engulfing her in a dominant, suffocating embrace. We see the ultimate psychological convergence here. Acute terror and profound attachment utilize the exact same neural pathways. Let us open this file together, you and I. The subject, Emma, presses her face into Dante's chest. Her sensory input is flooded with the olfactory markers of acute trauma, the metallic scent of fresh blood, and the sharp chemical trace of discharged firearms. Dante frames her face, his affect entirely flat, stating the threat is neutralized. This is a classic isolation tactic. He informs her that her previous reality is deceased, forcing a cognitive reset. She cannot return to her baseline life until his rivals are eradicated. We see this often in syndicate pathology. The clinical reality we must accept is that exposure to extreme violence irrevocably alters the brain's neural pathways, locking the door to the life you once knew. A profound autonomic nervous system response overtakes Emma. The bottom drops out of her stomach as Dante exhibits quiet, dominant authority, dictating that she must remain in his custody. He frames this captivity as a protective measure, a necessary variable for her biological survival. When questioned about the timeline, his visible distress, perhaps genuine, perhaps performative, suggests days or weeks. Every rational survival instinct in her prefrontal cortex signals her to flee, yet we observe the onset of psychological adaptation. Her physical resistance collapses into a whispered surrender, providing this apex predator a fleeting baseline of peace. The haunting lesson here is that our desperate minds will often reclassify our captor as our savior just to endure the night. Dante vocalizes his response with suppressed emotional volatility. He initiates a brief, desperate physical connection before retreating to cleanse the biological evidence from his hands. Left alone, Emma experiences a critical juncture on the velvet couch. This is the incubation phase of trauma bonding. Her nervous system should be driving her out the door, yet a profound psychological anchor paralyzes her. She is actively developing what we clinically term Stockholm Syndrome, romanticizing the very source of her mortal peril. It is a fascinating cognitive distortion. The simple truth of human behavior is that when we routinely ignore our own internal warning systems, we are actively preparing our own psychological execution. We observe a bizarre behavioral shift. Dante emerges with damp hair, his defensive sociopathic armor temporarily discarded. He initiates a domestic ritual in the kitchen, organizing flour, eggs, and ricotta. Emma questions this severe deviation from his baseline behavior. He displays momentary vulnerability, citing a maternal recipe for cannoli he cannot successfully replicate. This is a regression technique, an attempt to simulate the normative socialization he was denied. Emma approaches, her empathy overriding her self-preservation. Her delicate movements guide his calloused, lethal hands. The takeaway from this behavioral anomaly is clear. Even the most violent offenders occasionally require the simulation of a quiet, mundane reality to stave off complete psychological collapse. They engage in the repetitive motion of preparing dough, an action that serves as a grounding technique against external stressors. Dante breaks the silence to detail his origin trauma. His mother succumbed to illness when he was 12, triggering his father's descent into substance dependency and violent volatility. By 15, Dante had assumed control of the criminal enterprise to survive. He explicitly denies seeking empathy, framing his evolution into a predator as a necessary adaptation. He is rationalizing his antisocial personality traits. The clinical lesson remains absolute. Early childhood trauma may permanently alter your neurological development, but it never serves as a valid justification for the immense suffering you knowingly inflict on others. Let us examine the escalation here, you and I. Dante abruptly halts the domestic simulation. With chilling emotional detachment, he confesses to the lethal force he utilized earlier that evening, asserting his territorial dominance over his assets. Emma suppresses her fear response and asks if she is now classified as his property. Dante confirms, stating his possessive ideation began the moment they met. A neurotypical subject would immediately flee. Instead, entrenched in her trauma bond, Emma steps closer, claiming she is unafraid of his pathology. He warns her she should be. We must understand this fundamental truth. The most dangerous threats to our survival are rarely the strangers in the dark, but the psychological predators we willingly let into our minds. The situational tension reaches a critical mass. Emma elevates her physical proximity, whispering that he should regret her. This verbal trigger shatters his rigid impulse control. He physically relocates her to the kitchen counter, exhibiting aggressive, desperate possessiveness. His tactile grip indicates a man using a physical anchor to prevent a total dissociative break. Emma responds by channeling her chronic stress and irrational attachment into a chaotic physical exchange. Upon separation, Dante displays a rare moment of cognitive dissonance, resting his head against hers and predicting her eventual hatred of him. It is a textbook push-and-pull dynamic. The reality of trauma-induced attachment is that it operates entirely outside the boundaries of logical risk assessment. He insists upon her future resentment, and she exhibits the euphoric denial of a dependent victim, smiling and confirming his hypothesis. Dante produces a raw vocalization of amusement, a severe break from his typical rigid affect. The subsequent physical connection is decelerated, executed with the full conscious awareness of impending mutual destruction. Emma reciprocates, completely abandoning her survival instincts. Observe this critical psychological paradox. There are moments when the human brain, exhausted by chronic hypervigilance, will actively pursue the exact destructive stimuli it has been trying to avoid. They become so hyper-focused on their shared pathology that the environmental alarm of the smoking oven is entirely ignored until it actively shrieks through the penthouse. The auditory assault of the alarm triggers a rapid behavioral pivot. Dante utilizes aggressive native language and disposes of the charred failure, while Emma attempts to clear the atmospheric hazard. When the decibel level normalizes, they experience a spontaneous release of built-up psychological tension through uncontrollable laughter. This is a biological necessity, a sudden influx of oxygen to a brain suffocating in chronic stress. Bypassing logic, they sit in the low light consuming the raw ingredients. Dante finally deactivates his defensive mechanisms, articulating his deeply repressed, traumatic memories. The clinical takeaway is undeniable. Authentic psychological intimacy is rarely constructed in perfect conditions, but in the chaotic wreckage of our failed attempts at normalcy. Emma mirrors his self-disclosure, detailing memories of her grandmother to build reciprocal trust. They maintain this verbal exchange until dawn alters their circadian rhythms, pushing Emma toward extreme physical exhaustion. Dante reassumes a controlling caretaking role, dictating her sleep schedule. When she attempts to establish a boundary by suggesting the sofa, he immediately nullifies it. He frames her face and verbally commits to decelerating their physical escalation. Emma tests this boundary, questioning his resolve. We see his micro-expressions darken, but he enforces his own impulse control, stepping away to act as her exterior guard. The behavioral reality is stark. Genuine power is never demonstrated by the forceful acquisition of a target, but by the highly disciplined capacity to delay gratification. Emma experiences a fleeting desire to resist, but her neurological reserves are depleted. She allows him to direct her into his primary territory. She collapses in her clothes, inhaling his pheromonal markers before slipping into unconsciousness. 10 hours later, her sleep cycle is violently interrupted by aggressive auditory stimuli penetrating the walls. The circadian shift is jarring. Two dominant male voices are engaged in a severe verbal altercation. Dante is vibrating with lethal, homicidal ideation, clashing against the toxic authority of an older syndicate figure. Here is the clinical reality of chronic instability. For those embedded in a high-threat ecosystem, perceived safety is merely a temporary neurological illusion, masking the inevitable return of absolute chaos. We observe a classic confrontation between a megalomaniac narcissist and his volatile enforcer. The older boss, Vittorio, utilizes psychological manipulation to mock Dante for introducing a civilian liability into their violent matrix. Dante controls his physiological response, his voice dropping to a territorial baseline as he declares Emma under his absolute jurisdiction. Vittorio counters with a sociopathic laugh, correctly identifying that Emma is now the perfect psychological leverage to exploit Dante's core vulnerabilities. Dante's ocular focus turns to absolute frost, promising lethal retaliation against any approach. The psychological truth we must extract is severe. In this pathology of violence, total fixation on another human being is always a fatal vulnerability, waiting to be ruthlessly exploited by your enemies. Let us examine the pathology of an apex predator. The patriarch, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, demands if Dante grasps the blood price of a syndicate war over a brief fixation. Beyond the door, Emma experiences acute panic, her spine pressed against the wood. Dante's response is a chilling exhibition of possessive rage. The cost is irrelevant, he murmurs, because no external force touches his claimed object. The older man attempts emasculation, calling him soft, but Dante clinically replies that she anchors his humanity. The syndicate voted for her exile, yet Dante's deadpan refusal invites anyone to test his lethal threshold. Sometimes, what we romantically label as devotion is merely a terrifying willingness to burn the world to ashes to keep one obsession warm. You and I will unpack this standoff together, as unchecked pride always blinds the narcissist. Vincent attempts to manipulate Dante, accusing him of betraying his bloodline. Dante remains a fortress, refusing to sacrifice her to the wolves. Desperate, Vincent weaponizes the memory of Dante's deceased father, claiming the man would feel profound shame. It is a fatal miscalculation of Dante's trauma triggers. His eyes turn to cutting frost. He clinically dismisses his father as a drunken traitor, stating that if such a ghost feels shame, Dante's trajectory is correct. Vincent chokes on empty air and retreats. The elevator doors seal a suffocating quiet into the penthouse as Emma steps out, visibly trembling from the adrenaline spike. Confronting the toxic ghosts of our past is the only method to achieve true psychological freedom. Emma whispers his name, breaking the silence. Dante pivots sharply, his neural pathways still flooded with violent defense mechanisms, but the sight of her overrides his aggression. He crosses the room, pulling her into a desperate physical anchor. Exhibiting early signs of Down Stockholmism, she trembles, terrified he initiated a gang war for her. Dante smooths her hair, his vocal cadence dropping to a soothing baseline. He clinically reframes the narrative. He did not start a war. He merely eliminated a threat. Displaying zero remorse, he admits he terminated rival brothers to ensure her survival. She asks about the hostile man who just departed. Dante's jaw tightens. It was Vincent, his father's closest associate. In this brutal existence, the most severe psychological trauma always originates from those deeply embedded in our personal histories. Dante reveals the demand to isolate her until the violence subsides. Emma, showing rational survival instincts, suggests the old man might have a point. Dante's grip tightens, a manifestation of severe separation anxiety. He vows she will never be discarded unless she autonomously chooses to leave, offering her an exit from his pathology. Her instinct screams to flee, but her psychological conditioning is shifting. Beneath his lethal exterior, she perceives a fractured psyche, using her as a tether to cognitive stability. She verbalizes her desire to stay. The sudden rush of relief washing over him is clinically staggering. He kisses her with a starving compulsion, pressing his forehead to hers. We all require one authentic anchor in a chaotic reality. Sometimes choosing to remain in the storm is the bravest psychological adaptation a person can make. Dante makes a pathological vow to act as an absolute barrier against external threats. This trauma bonding is abruptly interrupted by a violent vibration on the glass table. His subordinates had transferred her personal effects to the secure location. Emma retrieves the device, and the physiological response is immediate. Vascular constriction drains her face. It is her maternal figure. After 14 days of silence following her financial subsidy, the mother finally initiates contact. Emma answers, experiencing a massive cortisol spike. Her landlord reported her absent, and rumors suggest an abduction. Operating under immense cognitive load, Emma modulates her vocal cords, falsely insisting her situation is optimal. Life possesses a predictable pathology of dragging our unresolved familial baggage into our realities, exactly when we are most vulnerable. Emma generates a synthetic laugh, formulating a cover story about staying with a peer. Her mother exploits a psychological vulnerability, stating Emma lacks social connections because she depletes her resources to sustain their family. It is an excruciating behavioral truth. Emma suppresses her nervous tremors, unaware Dante is clinically observing her distress. The maternal figure escalates, demanding to know if her safety is compromised. Emma's neural pathways freeze. How does one rationally explain that assassins are tracking her to damage a syndicate boss? Instead, she confesses she met a protector named Dante. The silence on the line is profound. Her mother notes the cognitive dissonance. Emma never previously accepted even basic assistance. The most debilitating psychological burdens are often the trauma responses we stubbornly refuse to extinguish. The mother's vocal pitch elevates, theorizing a hostage dynamic. Emma looks up, locking onto Dante. In the facial micro-expressions of an apex predator, she identifies only anomalous emotional warmth, a key catalyst for Stockholm Syndrome. She insists Dante is providing a secure environment against an incomprehensible threat. The mother de-escalates, establishing a daily communication protocol under threat of police intervention. Terminating the connection, Emma displays acute psychomotor agitation, preparing to smash the device. Dante calmly intercepts the hardware, offering clinical reassurance that maternal anxiety is a biological standard. Emma's emotional suppression fractures. She highlights the parasitic reality. That same maternal anxiety never interrupts the monthly financial extraction. The pathological truth is that toxic emotional attachments always demand an exorbitant psychological invoice. Dante guides her toward the sofa, delivering a cognitive reframe. Stick with me, because you and I both need to analyze this dynamic. Sharing genetic material never grants a behavioral license for psychological parasitism. Emma's muscular tension collapses against him, citing her mother as her sole biological anchor. Dante reinforces the dependency, murmuring she belongs to him now. Uttered by a criminal architect, this is a textbook display of pathological possession. Yet, her compromised limbic system processes it as absolute sanctuary. They experience a transient stabilization of their nervous systems. But in this violent theater, equilibrium is an illusion. A sudden ringtone triggers a severe startle response. Dante utters a profanity, his facial musculature resetting to its predatory default. In the clinical study of trauma, prolonged peace is merely a fleeting psychological anomaly. Dante initiates a pacing motor pattern indicative of a confined predator, verbalizing aggressive directives. Emma intercepts 3 distinct auditory cues: war, blood, and betrayal. The room's atmosphere plummets as Dante terminates the call. His focus completely devoid of empathy. He dictates his departure, assigning a guard as a physical barrier at the exit. However, we observe an abrupt neurochemical shift in Emma. Exhibiting sudden defiant ideation, she rejects the parameters of this gilded containment unit. She demands to shadow his movements, exhausted from passive isolation, while he executes violence for her preservation. She requires visual confirmation of his pathological reality. Consider this behavioral pivot. Stepping directly into an environment of extreme terror is often the exact mechanism required to shatter our cognitive illusions and initiate raw survival protocols. Dante suppresses her requests, citing the extreme mortality rates of the external environment. Yet Emma maintains her stance, penetrating his psychological defenses. She articulates a preference for active trauma exposure over the slow cognitive decay of isolated safety, demanding he reveal the sociopathic core he conceals. We observe severe cognitive dissonance in his micro-expressions, the conflict between preserving her baseline and assimilating her into his pathology. Ultimately, his narcissistic need for proximity wins. He capitulates, establishing rigid parameters. She must maintain physical contact and initiate flight protocols upon weapon deployment. He issues a clinical warning that this exposure will permanently rewire her neural pathways. Her blink rate remains steady at 0. Authentic psychological maturation requires executing terrifying decisions and fully assimilating the permanent neurological scars that follow. 20 minutes later, the armored chassis of a black Audi absorbs them into the nocturnal landscape. Emma wears dark, utilitarian garments, symbolizing her physical transition into his ecosystem. Dante exhibits the muscle rigidity of a coiled predator, his jaw locked in acute hypervigilance. Up front, tactical personnel navigate desolate roads while maintaining physical contact with heavy ballistics. They arrive at an isolated facility, monitored by operatives displaying severe emotional blunting. As Emma breaches the perimeter, the collective gaze of the syndicate fixates upon her anomalous presence. Dante initiates an aggressive physical claim, interlocking his digits with hers and pulling her tightly against his side. The interior reveals a massive logistical operation of laundered currency and illicit cargo. It is a clinical reminder that the most severe pathological systems operate seamlessly, just beneath the surface of societal norms. The industrial space resonates with the auditory feedback of heavy labor. Yet, the microsecond Dante steps onto the concrete, the facility undergoes an instantaneous behavioral suppression, plunging into absolute silence. He issues a single command, and the operatives recede into the shadows. He maneuvers Emma into a soundproof glass enclosure, a transparent observation deck designed for the narcissist to survey his environment. Utilizing a terrifyingly regulated vocal tone, he dismantles her remaining cognitive biases. The visible logistics are legally compliant, but the subterranean network of illicit wagering and laundered capital, that is the pure sociopathic reality. Emma's digits compress against the desk as she experiences acute vertigo from the psychological shock. Let us recognize this truth together. The most lethal pathological secrets are rarely securely contained. They camouflage themselves in plain sight, perfectly disguised as everyday routines. Observe the baseline behavior of the megalomaniac narcissist. Dante anchors himself against the mahogany desk, his gaze locking onto her hyperventilation like a predator isolating a wounded target. He clinically removes his socially acceptable mask, presenting the tailored suits as mere camouflage for his deeply ingrained violent pathology. Emma averts her eyes, her whispered question probing to see if his enablers recognize the psychopath they serve. Dante's response is textbook dark triad. The loyal ones are complicit while the rest are simply bought. This clinical silence is abruptly broken by a phone ringing. His physical rigidity indicates a massive narcissistic injury. A subordinate is stealing. Today, you and I are going to unpack this case together, recognizing a fundamental truth. Greed functions as an irrational compulsion, and acquiring unearned power invariably pulls a person into a total psychological collapse. The psychological profile deepens as Dante reveals the thief is a trusted lieutenant. The calculated emptiness in his vocal tone induces a severe somatic anxiety response in Emma, twisting her stomach into knots. He maintains prolonged eye contact, projecting a manufactured sorrow to manipulate her empathy. He demands she accept his antisocial reality, coldly stating he will physically destroy the traitor without a microscopic trace of remorse. Emma's self-preservation instincts trigger an acute flight response. Yet, exhibiting early symptoms of trauma bonding, she overrides her own safety protocols and demands to observe his depravity firsthand. Stick with me, because you and I must always remember a vital psychological mechanism. Avoiding our darkest realities never neutralizes the threat. It merely allows the subconscious shadows to multiply unchecked behind our backs. Dante displays a micro-expression of vulnerability, a rare deviation from his baseline. He issues a verbal warning, minimizing her capacity to comprehend his violent nature. Emma, however, closes the physical distance, exhibiting an intense, almost clinical defiance. She explicitly rejects the victim role, insisting she requires empirical evidence of his brutality to justify her continued attachment. Dante registers this as validation, his jaw relaxing into a posture of twisted respect. He instructs her to establish a boundary, guiding her toward a reinforced steel door and a lightless stairwell. Her autonomic nervous system spikes in pure panic as they descend. It teaches us a grim lesson. Confronting our core phobias head-on is absolutely necessary to decode the complex, often disturbing realities buried deep inside our own subconscious minds. Let us examine the environment of this containment unit. We are looking at a subterranean concrete cell, an architectural space designed specifically for psychological destruction. Under a single erratic light source, a male subject is restrained to a chair, exhibiting violent tremors consistent with acute mortal terror. Two armed enforcers display visible cognitive dissonance at Emma's presence, but Dante dismisses them with an alpha-dominant gesture. The heavy iron door locks, creating a sensory deprivation chamber. The captive subject is in full respiratory distress, weeping profusely, while frantically attempting to rationalize the theft of $200,000 over a 6-month period. We see clearly here that panic is a severely compromised internal compass. Acute desperation degrades critical thinking, blinding the human brain to the catastrophic consequences that inevitably follow our most irrational decisions. Analyze the precise physical control in Dante's posture here. He actively suppresses his vocal amplitude, maintaining a flat, emotionless effect that induces far more psychological terror than an aggressive outburst. He softly interrogates the bleeding captive about the logic of robbing a syndicate. The subject experiences a complete emotional rupture, deploying a fabricated narrative about his daughter, requiring expensive medical intervention. Dante dissects this manipulation instantly, citing evidence that he personally funded that exact procedure 8 months prior. Stripped of his defense mechanisms, the thief confesses to severe pathological gambling debts, ultimately identifying his handler as Vincent Russo. This interaction reinforces a fundamental behavioral law. Constructing elaborate deceptions to conceal our failures inevitably traps us in a psychological prison of our own design. This revelation triggers a catastrophic cognitive shift. Vincent, the same associate observed in their domestic environment hours earlier, is the orchestrator. Dante exhibits a predatory freezing response, an extreme cessation of motor function indicating lethal intent. He clinically demands to know if Vincent mandated the embezzlement. The captive attributes the theft to his own impulse control disorder, explaining Vincent simply leveraged the debt to extract intelligence regarding Dante and his concealed female companion. The atmospheric tension in the cell becomes suffocating. Bypassing any verbal warning, Dante executes a sudden kinetic strike, elevating the subject and the chair entirely off the ground by his trachea. Trust is an incredibly fragile psychological construct. Once a core attachment is severed through deliberate betrayal, the neurological pathways can never be completely repaired. Dante suddenly disengages his stranglehold. The apparatus crashes against the concrete floor, allowing the hypoxic subject to desperately intake oxygen. We observe Dante looming above him, exhibiting extreme muscular tension. In a modulated, rasping tone designed maximum psychological penetration, he commands the subordinate to evacuate. He establishes a strict timeline of midnight, guaranteeing the systemic termination of the man's entire familial network if any secrets are compromised. Emma monitors the subject's frantic retreat, then clinically points out to Dante that he just pardoned a condemned threat. We must look at this together, because unpredictable mercy is a fascinating anomaly in a sociopathic structure. Granting an unearned reprieve possesses the unique power to permanently alter an individual's entire behavioral trajectory. The rigid narcissistic armor immediately fragments. Dante pivots toward Emma, his vocal cords strained, displaying acute emotional distress within his gaze. He admits the informant has effectively placed a mortality marker on her identity. He rationalizes his uncharacteristic restraint as a direct response to her observation, a desperate attempt to manipulate her perception away from his monstrous reality. Emma enters his immediate proximity, applying tactile stimulation to his face, instructing him to abandon his defensive persona. He confesses to persistent homicidal ideation, inquiring if his internal psychopathy induces fear. She acknowledges her limbic system is terrified, yet she actively refuses to retreat. Genuine human attachment is not the pursuit of psychological symmetry. It is the conscious decision to stabilize a partner during their most catastrophic mental collapses. Dante exhibits an avoidant attachment response, physically withdrawing from her soothing contact. He issues a severe directive for her to escape his toxic environment. However, Emma acts as a grounding mechanism within the sterile cell. She verbalizes full consent to his antisocial lifestyle, integrating his darkest pathological traits into her accepted reality. This shatters his cognitive framework. He questions the paradox of a stable female seeking proximity to a hyper-violent male who initiates territorial bloodshed. Her response defies conventional psychiatric logic. She articulates that this extreme environment has catalyzed her first genuine state of conscious arousal, elevating her from basic survival into actualized significance. Humans often minimize their own footprint to remain unseen. Securing a partner who validates your complex reality is a massive catalyst for permanent behavioral evolution. This unregulated display of loyalty dismantles his remaining psychological defenses. Dante initiates intense physical contact, locking lips with a frantic compulsion akin to an asphyxiating subject locating a vital air supply. This mirrors the classic manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome, where Emma actively channels her residual trauma directly back into her captor. Following this emotional dysregulation, he aligns their foreheads, verbalizing a vow that justifies massive future violence on her behalf. Yet, just as their maladaptive bond stabilizes, an auditory trigger obliterates the calm. Emma's phone activates. Her maternal figure-esque voice lacks normal cadence, quietly reporting a home invasion. Then, a secondary highly narcissistic male voice overrides the audio. You and I have probably both noticed this cruel pattern. Catastrophic trauma invariably breaches our defenses, precisely when our nervous system finally attempts to regulate. The visual field isolates Emma's kinetic tremors as she grips the device. The vocal signature belongs to Vincent Russo, deploying sociopathic charm while proposing a mandatory negotiation regarding her future. Upon processing this acoustic data, Dante's facial musculature locks into an expression indicating premeditated homicide. He non-verbally instructs her to amplify the audio. Vincent systematically details his entrapment protocol, demanding she enter an unauthorized vehicle unescorted. He reframes this hostile extraction as a diplomatic consultation, creating an impossible psychological double-bind to coerce her compliance. The sheer pathological arrogance required to execute this maneuver is a fascinating study in criminal power dynamics. We must recognize a terrifying clinical reality. The most devastating psychological violations frequently present with a disarming affect, proving that apex predators operate completely unmasked in broad daylight. Dante invades the acoustic space of the device. His vocal frequency drops into a deeply menacing register, articulating explicit threats of total structural destruction if Vincent inflicts trauma upon the maternal hostage. Vincent counters with a hollow, psychopathic laugh that reverberates through the concrete containment unit. He actively denies any sadistic intent toward the non-combatant, manipulating Emma by claiming he merely wishes to provide her with cognitive clarity regarding her choices. He then delivers the ultimate behavioral ultimatum. She is allocated precisely 15 minutes to comply, or her biological mother will be terminated. The connection severs abruptly. Emma enters a state of acute catatonia, her sensory processing shutting down despite Dante's escalating aggressive commands to his enforcers. Within the clinical study of trauma, subjects are routinely cornered by incompatible survival imperatives, and resolving these paradoxes always demands an agonizing psychological toll. Let us open this case file together, shall we? We observe the subject, Emma, entering a state of acute psychogenic shock. The autonomic nervous system collapses, her knees buckle. She is paralyzed by a classic double-bind scenario engineered by a megalomaniac. Vincent has perfectly calibrated this trauma. To stay with the enforcer who awakened her dormant emotional state means condemning her maternal figure. To surrender is clinical suicide. Dante catches her. His motor response is entirely driven by territorial panic, but auditory exclusion renders his voice white noise to her. It is a fascinating psychological fracture. True resilience is not the absence of fear, but rather the grim capacity to choose which piece of your psyche you are willing to amputate for survival. Document the severe neurological tremors in her extremities. Emma projects the fear that a megalomaniac like Vincent will terminate the hostage regardless of compliance. Dante exhibits a terrifyingly flat affect. The light vanishes from his eyes, replaced by the void of a sociopath preparing for violence. He coldly guarantees the systemic slaughter of Vincent's entire bloodline if the mother is harmed. He clinically overrides her panic, coordinating with his associate Marco to trace the cellular device. Emma is drowning in anticipatory grief, certain the intervention will fail. But escalating anxiety never neutralizes a threat. It merely accelerates the cortisol flood. In moments of extreme psychological warfare, finding a singular second of cognitive stillness is your only valid defense mechanism. We watch the ego defenses shatter entirely. Hot tears manifest as Emma verbalizes the parasitic nature of her maternal bond. Her mother exhibits classic narcissistic drain, extracting resources without a fraction of empathy. Yet, familial conditioning is a remarkably heavy anchor. Emma refuses to let her perish in a syndicate crossfire. No matter the toxicity of our origin, carrying the psychological weight of our primary caregivers is an almost inescapable human compulsion. Observing her total emotional collapse, Dante's sociopathic armor dissolves. He pulls her close, swearing on his fractured psyche to retrieve the hostage. She grips him, displaying acute trauma bonding, terrified, yet reliant on a violent enforcer. Psychological survival often demands we place our trust in the very shadows we once feared. The exact millisecond Emma submits to this trauma bond, the cellular device illuminates. Dante's facial musculature locks into cold marble. The target is inside Vincent's fortified compound. Watch his rapid behavioral shift back into the apex predator, commanding a heavy tactical strike force. You and I must analyze the grim variable Emma identifies next. She anchors to his sleeve, her vocal cords strained, asking a rational question. What prevents the megalomaniac from executing the hostage out of sheer spite? Dante freezes. He establishes direct eye contact and clinically admits that absolutely nothing prevents it. The most agonizing pathology we endure is recognizing our total lack of control over random chaos. True psychological resilience is stepping directly into the flames of the unknown regardless. The behavioral analysis deepens with Dante's next tactical maneuver. He coldly states his intention to breach the environment unassisted. If the hostage is harmed, his operatives will reduce the structure to ash. Emma exhibits severe panic, correctly diagnosing this as suicidal ideation. Dante bypasses her verbal logic, utilizing physical affection to override her hysteria, a desperate, dopamine-fluting kiss. He murmurs that the probability of a trap is irrelevant, prioritizing her emotional stabilization over his biological survival. Authentic attachment means sacrificing personal safety parameters to secure another's mental peace. He forces her into Marco's vehicle, dictating an absolute evacuation if he misses the 60-minute window. Emma reaches out, but the dark environment has already consumed him. We are witnessing a subject making peace with terminal velocity. Emma perceives this fatalistic radiation, enforcing a strict 60-minute boundary. Dante responds with a defensive smirk, initiating one final physical connection to imprint his neurological signature onto hers. The vehicle seals shut, leaving her in Marco's custody. Emma experiences massive nervous system arousal. Marco attempts verbal de-escalation, citing Dante's historical resilience, but Emma's clinical insight is remarkably sharp. She questions if his survival instinct was ever internally motivated, or merely passive suicidal ideation. Marco validates the grim hypothesis. Dante lacked a psychological anchor until her arrival. Acquiring a tangible vulnerability fundamentally alters the raw mechanics of how a damaged individual measures their own right to exist. Marco offers a clinical assessment, uncertain if this trauma bond will trigger fatal impulsivity in Dante or cold ruthlessness. The temperature drops, accelerating Emma's shivering. She probes Marco's tenure within this maladaptive environment. 8 years, he notes. His adherence stems from a deviation in typical syndicate pathology. Dante rejects narcissistic tyranny, managing his subordinates with genuine dignity. When Emma references the violent body count, Marco's effect remains completely flat. He categorizes the deceased as individuals who actively sought their own termination. Authentic loyalty is never extracted through primal terror. It is cultivated through consistent mutual respect. Marco remains certain that Vincent's hostage scenario is merely a manipulative behavioral stress test designed to force a fatal error. The auditory deprivation is ruptured by a ringtone. Let us examine the predator's methodology. Vincent's vocal resonance is uncomfortably regulated, broadcasting zero baseline stress. He confirms Dante's trajectory was the exact outcome of his operant conditioning. Emma begs for her mother's release, but Vincent applies an icy psychological tourniquet. He recounts observing Dante's metamorphosis from a traumatized adolescent into an emotionally detached sociopath. Dante's protective isolation was flawless, until a sudden fixation on a civilian dismantled his cognitive defenses. Every human architecture contains a structural flaw, and romantic attachment remains the most lethal exploit in behavioral warfare. The clinical gravity of this diagnosis paralyzes Emma's motor functions entirely, anchoring her to the cold concrete floor. Emma demands the objective of this manipulation. Vincent emits a hollow sound, devoid of humor, forcing her to confront a severe cognitive distortion. Her presence is dismantling the syndicate's apex predator. Narcissistic monarchs do not compromise power structures for a civilian stimulus. Yet Dante is overriding his survival algorithms for a rapid, trauma-based infatuation. Vincent guarantees this emotional hijack will result in fatal consequences. Emma frantically bargains, offering to erase her existence to ensure Dante's survival. Vincent delivers a clinical reality check. The surrounding sociopathic ecosystem has already detected his vulnerability. The behavioral choices we make emit systemic shockwaves we can never truly contain. Rival predators have isolated the scent of a beating heart, and the pack is already converging. The megalomaniac introduces his conditioning mechanism. Emma must sever the trauma bond, inflicting such profound damage that Dante's emotional receptors permanently calcify. Vincent offers to fund this geographic cure with falsified documentation. Aiming to restore Dante's antisocial baseline, Emma's cognitive processing struggles under the manipulation. She asks if a simulated mortality is required. Vincent's tone drops to a clinical whisper. He requires her voluntary permanent absence. The auditory impact of that absolute parameter triggers a physiological collapse. She drops onto a crate, rejecting Marco's physical intervention. We must recognize that the most agonizing psychological amputations are frequently endured in total isolation. Trembling, she questions the statistical validity of trusting a sociopath's verbal contract. Emma cross-examines the variable of deceit. Vincent maintains clinical detachment, noting her own somatic markers validate his hypothesis. She watched Dante dismantle his deterrence protocols just to maintain her biological rhythm. This hyperfocus guarantees a fatal operational blind spot. Distressed, Emma questions the megalomaniac's motive. Vincent exhibits a rare symptom of institutional fatigue. He identifies Dante as the optimal behavioral specimen, bound by a pathological oath to preserve him. He refuses to monitor another systemic collapse driven by unregulated dopamine. Untreated generational trauma will perpetually repeat its destructive loop until a conscious, severe intervention occurs. He clinically notes Dante's biological mother exhibited the exact same fatal dependency, which ultimately destroyed their entire functional ecosystem. Let us dissect this maneuver together. Vincent is executing advanced emotional extortion, weaponizing repressed trauma. He frames Dante's mother as a victim of extreme Stockholm syndrome, tolerating environmental rot to stabilize a fractured personality. Emma defensively projects, whispering she lacks that specific pathology. Vincent agrees, but applies his verbal scalpel with precision. He asserts she is domesticating an apex predator. In this ecosystem, a domesticated sociopath is merely a pending fatality. It is a chilling absolute. Unregulated devotion, devoid of rational boundaries, inevitably mutates into the exact toxin that eliminates us. He establishes a strict 24-hour parameter for her decision, terminating the connection. The camera retreats as Emma enters a profound, silent dissociative fugue state. We open the case file on the damp alleyway. Marco collapses onto the freezing concrete, begging for answers, but Emma is completely dissociating. She is trapped behind the glass of a severe trauma response. Intrusive flashes hijack her mind. Vincent, a megalomaniacal narcissist, weaving his manipulation against the phantom image of Dante soaked in blood. She chokes on the clinical terror that her Stockholm syndrome is signing his death warrant. Then a phone vibration shatters the trance. Dante found her mother. They are safe. A ragged gasp tears from her throat as adrenaline floods her nervous system. This reveals a devastating psychological truth. One single seed of doubt, planted deep in the subconscious mind, is enough to completely fracture a person's reality. You and I must pause right here to clinically examine her psychological spiral. Emma is suffocating under the cognitive dissonance of knowing her affection is a literal guillotine for the city's most lethal predator. Suddenly, the violent shriek of tires tears the silence apart. A black sedan skids into the alley. Emma bolts forward, on primal instinct. The steel door swings wide, and her mother collapses into her arms, trembling but alive. The frantic woman digs her nails into her daughter's skin, pleading to know the true pathology of these monsters. Over her mother's shaking shoulder, Emma locks eyes with Dante. His expression is a chilling, perfectly constructed sociopathic void. The hardest lesson we ever learn is that our deeply buried traumas always detonate when we lack the emotional tools to survive them. The emotional interrogation strikes the second they pull apart. Her mother exhibits an acute flight response, frantically demanding they vanish on a midnight bus. But observe Emma's behavioral shift. She gently pushes the older woman back, dropping a psychological bomb. She is done running. Her mother stares as if a foreign entity possesses her, screaming that these men are butchers. She points a trembling finger at Dante, labeling him a psychopath. She sobs she raised her child to avoid the shadows. Emma remains clinically detached, not blinking once. She calmly states her mother raised her to survive. The quiet baker is finally integrating into her dangerous new reality. It reminds us that true psychological resilience only crystallizes when we are backed against a concrete wall. Emma regulates her vocal tone perfectly, carrying the crushing weight of absolute conviction. She tells her mother this is exactly what brutal survival looks like. It means no longer drowning in debt or scrubbing floors until her knuckles bleed. Her mother sobs, swearing this narcissistic monster will drag her into a fatal crossfire. We observe Emma's gaze drift to the shadows where Dante stands. She confesses the darkest psychological truth buried in her psyche. She would rather die meaning something real than fade away as a nameless ghost. She was invisible in that bakery until Dante perceived her as the singular focus of his obsession. We all carry this profound human truth. We just want to feel truly validated and seen, even if the person watching is a violent king of the underworld. Her mother stares at her, presenting as an entirely shattered psyche, carrying the grief of generational trauma. She warns that this dark attachment will leave Emma destroyed. Emma holds her tight. She hears the warning, but her Stockholm Syndrome has overridden her fear centers. The older woman pulls away, marching straight up to the apex predator of Chicago. She swears that if her daughter bleeds, she will return from the grave to dismantle his empire. Dante does not flinch. He offers a slow nod, whispering that it is an acceptable parameter. Absolute ice runs through his veins. Marco gently guides the exhausted mother to a vehicle. This teaches us a heavy lesson. Sometimes, protecting the people you love requires the clinical detachment to lock them so safely inside a gilded cage. Examine this behavioral shift with me. The psychological profile here is fascinating. The headlights fade, and Emma turns to Dante. The untouchable boss is experiencing a complete emotional collapse. Dried crimson stains his cuffs from recent violence. Yet the second he registers her presence, the ruthless leader dissolves. He softly asks if she is safe. She answers with a dissociative laugh, detailing the megalomaniac's bargain. Total safety and a new identity, just to abandon Dante to his rivals. Dante freezes, bracing for the trauma. When she admits she needed time to think, his devastation is clinically agonizing to observe. It reminds us of a bitter truth. The deepest psychological wounds never come from our enemies, but from the simple hesitation of our primary emotional attachments. Emma initiates a grounding technique, taking his face firmly in her shaking hands. She commits to their trauma bond, then demands empirical truth. Will standing by her side result in his premature death? Dante drops his narcissistic defense mechanisms and whispers a single probability. Probably. That raw honesty completely disrupts her cognitive flow. She begs to understand his self-destructive pathology. He admits he would rather experience a violent termination holding her than survive another decade in complete psychological isolation. She is his singular positive stimulus in 15 years of pathological violence. The clinical lesson here is undeniable. A desperate human mind will always choose a fatal, chaotic connection over the agonizingly cold safety of absolute solitude. Emma's stress response manifests in tears as she questions the burden of survivor's guilt. What happens if she gets him killed? Dante drops his behavioral armor, offering her complete autonomy. This is a rare anomaly in captivity dynamics. He refuses to cage her in an environment causing psychological decay. Emma's cognitive dissonance resolves. Vincent's clinical evaluation was incorrect. This attachment did not regress the predator into weakness. It simply catalyzed his latent empathy. In his sociopathic ecosystem, a functioning emotional core is a fatal flaw. Witnessing his empathy, her choice becomes a simple calculation. She will stay. Here is a factual baseline. True loyalty only proves its psychological worth when the stakes threaten to completely destroy you. An auditory void hangs in the air as she finalizes her decision. She is staying. His cortisol levels drop as tension melts off his shoulders. But she is not finished. The psychological power dynamic shifts. She dictates a new operational reality, demanding to function as an equal accomplice rather than a fragile dependent. No more unilateral decisions. They engage this conflict symmetrically. Dante exhibits a genuine dopamine response. A rare smile crosses his fatigued features. He kisses her to seal this aggressive psychological contract. She matches his intensity, transferring her panic directly into his nervous system. Remember this clinical lesson. To maintain psychological equilibrium in any bond, you must actively demand the authority you deserve. Upon disengaging, Dante's respiration is elevated, his pupils dilated with hyperarousal. He insists they evacuate before his impulse control degrades. Emma exhibits a counterintuitive response, laughing despite the lethal threat vectors surrounding her. She instructs him to take her home. He repeats the word home as if processing a completely foreign concept. We observe their transit back to his fortified environment, his scarred hand providing constant tactile feedback to hers. Emma's amygdala remains stimulated by impending violence, but beneath that neurological storm, she feels perfectly anchored. This brings us to a fundamental truth. Home is rarely just a physical structure. More often, it is the psychological anchor, holding your hand through the darkest chaos. Let us analyze the origin of this pathological attachment. They step into his penthouse, and Dante engages the heavy deadbolts. He turns to her with a micro-expression that spikes her heart rate, murmuring a confession he should have disclosed earlier. Emma braces for another violent trauma trigger. Instead, he confesses his fixation predated their introduction. He observed her catering a gala, concealed in the shadows, quietly tracking her behavioral patterns for 3 consecutive hours. He clinically logged her tireless work ethic, her empathetic smiles toward corrupt sociopaths, and her kindness to children. Here is a simple clinical lesson to always carry with you. You never really know who is quietly cataloging your brightest energy from the darkest corners of the room. Dante obliterates the physical space between them, a classic dominance tactic. His voice drops to a broken whisper, framing her soul as a rare anomaly in his world. Emma stands paralyzed, completely stripped of her verbal agency. He clinically confesses to running a full background check on her from day one. He initially planned a grand, narcissistic gesture to pay her debts anonymously so she could vanish, but his pathology of control overrode his mercy. Gripping her face, he admits her defiant smile anchored itself in his mind. He manufactured the entire financial crisis just to force her into his orbit, rationalizing his obsession as fate. The lesson here is quite simple. Sometimes, what we romantically call destiny is merely a calculated push from a person who absolutely refuses to let you go. The kingpin stands swallowed by shadows, visually mirroring his fractured psyche. He owns his dark manipulation with zero remorse. He casually confesses to freezing her bakery accounts, engineering a financial crisis so severe she would be forced into his domain. He never predicted her explosive trauma response, kicking his heavy door open at midnight to fight his armed guards. Emma actually laughs through her tears, a clear indicator of Stockholm Syndrome, whispering she expected an execution. Dante wipes away a tear and seals her fate with an irreversible vow. He is keeping her. Emma challenges his grandiosity, asking if forever is a genuine variable. The lesson here is deeply human. When you finally find the exact piece your wounded mind desperately needs, you will do absolutely anything to hold on to it. You and I have analyzed enough case files to know how these tragic dependencies end. But watch closely as Emma actively accelerates her own captivity. Her hands tremble as she pulls this apex predator down into a kiss that permanently rewires their neural pathways. Dante surrenders his dominant position completely, clinging to her like a drowning man, finding his first breath of oxygen. When they finally break apart in the dim light, the megalomaniac's heavy emotional armor shatters. His expression fractures as he softly confesses his love. He admits this defies rational logic and moves at a highly dangerous velocity. But the words bleed out regardless. The psychological lesson is vital for anyone to hear. When a profound truth is screaming inside your own bones, keeping it violently buried will inevitably break your mind. We clinically observe Emma staring at the city's most lethal architect of violence. Her voice is a fragile whisper when she vocalizes her delusion, admitting she loves him too. That raw reciprocation completely destabilizes Dante's core reality. He crashes back into her, reasserting physical dominance with a desperate kiss. Emma melts into the heat, fully surrendering to her Stockholm Syndrome. She consciously chooses to believe that even clinical psychopaths deserve a peaceful resolution. Dante backs her against the cold marble counter, requiring immediate tactile verification. He grips her hair with aggressive possessiveness, needing physical proof she is not a hallucination. The lesson here is undeniably real. Sometimes you simply must fight for the exact connection you want, no matter how chaotic and violent the surrounding battlefield becomes. The physiological arousal of the scene spikes instantly. Emma experiences severe adrenaline tremors, her motor skills failing against his shirt buttons. Displaying classic poor impulse control, Dante simply yanks the fabric over his head. She gasps, reminding him of his prior verbal contract to proceed slowly. A rough laugh rumbles from his throat as he admits to the manipulation, his patience evaporated. His lips trace her neck, seeking her rapid pulse. But just as the psychological consumption peaks, a jarring phone ring fractures their isolated environment. Dante mutters to ignore the stimulus, but the noise is relentless. Snatching the device, his eyes scan the caller data, and his emotional state instantly flatlines into absolute ice. Life always provides a cruel grounding lesson. The harsh reality of the external world will never politely wait for you to finish your perfect, isolated moment. Here is the brutal cognitive shift that alters their baseline. Vincent is calling. Emma watches the predatory confidence drain from Dante, sensing a catastrophic environmental change. Dante activates the speaker, warning his sociopathic mentor he has 30 seconds. Vincent sounds disturbingly relaxed, dropping a stressor that shatters their trauma-bonded peace. The rival families have analyzed Dante's new emotional vulnerability and executed a lethal strike. He has been entirely outmaneuvered, his empire actively being dismantled. Vincent offers one highly manipulative exit strategy. Dante retains his authoritarian control, but only if he surrenders Emma to the violent factions tonight. It is the ultimate psychological poison pill. The lesson here is written in stone. Always expect your worst adversaries to strike precisely while your human heart is profoundly distracted. Vincent lays the psychological torture bare. It is an impossible binary choice engineered to break a megalomaniac, the absolute power he bled for, or the human anchor beside him. Emma experiences acute vascular constriction, losing her color. She presses trembling hands to his chest, verifying the violent tachycardia beneath her palms. Dante aggressively demands a unanimous vote to strip his authority. But Vincent holds the ultimate leverage. He weaponizes a ruthless wartime clause, drafted by the source of Dante's generational trauma, his own father. 3 rival factions have already signed the executive death warrant. 1 more signature, and 15 years of violent sacrifices vanish. Dante severs the connection with chilling, clinical detachment. The brutal truth of this life is simple. The traumatic ghosts of our past always returns exactly when we finally find a genuine reason to live. Stick with me here, because we are observing a total psychological paradigm shift. The second the call drops, Dante externalizes his dysregulation, shattering his phone against the plaster in a burst of violent rage. Emma exhibits a classic flinch response, but the extreme tension in Dante's posture confirms the lethal reality. She asks the highly rational question, what happens to his physical safety without his systemic protection? Dante pulls her into his chest, applying deep pressure to regulate them both. Maintaining intense eye contact, he swears his criminal empire holds 0 value now. She begs him not to dismantle his life for a newly formed attachment, but cognitive resolve is absolute. He instructs her to simply watch him execute the destruction. Sometimes genuine loyalty means being entirely willing to burn your own carefully constructed kingdom to the ground to keep one person safe. The megalomaniac's cognitive dam finally breaks, allowing Dante to verbally process 15 years of repressed trauma. He ruled an empire he inherently despised, only to face an isolated death surrounded by subordinates who purely fear him. He cradles her face, categorizing her as the only uncorrupted variable he has ever touched. Emma weeps, utilizing active grounding techniques to force him back to objective reality. Without the syndicate's infrastructure, his predators will initiate a lethal hunt. Dante stands rigid, adopting a grandiose defense mechanism, whispering for them to try. But Emma refuses to validate his suicidal ideation. She firmly dismantles his logic, reminding him that an isolated apex predator cannot survive an organized swarm. It reminds us of a simple psychological truth. You can possess the most resilient mind on Earth, but no one survives the darkest traumatic battles in this life entirely alone. You and I are going to look at this together, because Emma's brain suddenly shifts into high-level executive functioning. She demands the exact names on the execution mandate. Dante clinically recites their pathological profiles. The Russos were predictable. The Calabreses signed due to a retaliatory blood feud. Then the Lombardists, sadistic sociopaths who view Dante's refusal to utilize physical torture as a fatal flaw. To them, his trauma bond with Emma is definitive proof of weakness. But Emma's prefrontal cortex identifies a critical loophole. If 4 signatures are required to strip his power, they simply must intercept the final variable before the ink dries. It is a highly dangerous, statistically improbable intervention. But when your structured reality collapses, the only viable method of survival is to firmly grasp the single isolated piece you actually have the power to change. We watch Emma rapidly process the fragmented behavioral data. If 3 hostile entities have signed, who controls the final variable? Dante identifies the Marchese organization. They exhibit extreme risk aversion, maintaining a neutral baseline to avoid conflict. With their patriarch declining, his Machiavellian daughter, Sophia, now manipulates the board. Emma exhibits 0 hesitation, insisting they initiate a direct confrontation. Dante argues the systemic parameters are statistically fatal, but Emma's gaze locks in with clinical focus. If Sophia is maintaining neutrality, she can be psychologically maneuvered. They simply must diagnose her deepest subconscious deficit and artificially supply it. It is a profound lesson in human behavioral conditioning. If you truly require an individual's absolute compliance, you must ignore your own survival and offer them the one psychological crutch they cannot live without. Let us open this case file together. We observe a cognitive shift in the subject Dante. He realizes the Marchese syndicate operates not on impulsive aggression, but on high-functioning capitalism. Their shipping empire requires absolute homeostasis. Emma, exhibiting early stages of trauma bonding, urges him to weaponize this reality. Displacing an apex predator like Dante will fracture the criminal ecosystem, inciting lesser sociopaths to butcher each other for his territory. Sophia Marchesi is too calculated to let street violence drain her resources. The clinical takeaway here is quite profound. When we force an opponent to confront the tangible, destructive consequences of a destabilized environment, pragmatic self-preservation will consistently neutralize their blind greed. We must analyze the hyper-arousal phase of Emma's mind. She insists on confronting Sophia immediately, defying rational protocol. Dante views her urgency as acute mania, yet Emma's survival instinct correctly identifies Vincent as a threat who will contaminate Sophia's perspective by dawn. Dante's sudden laughter is an involuntary release of severe cognitive tension. Emma rationalizes her behavior by embracing the shared psychosis required to attach oneself to a criminal mastermind. It points to a stark reality. In environments of extreme volatility, adopting a reckless, unpredictable behavioral pattern is often the only viable survival mechanism. We now observe them in a sedan, Emma physically grounding herself to face the apex predator. In antisocial subcultures, optical dominance is the primary defense mechanism. Dante mandated the formal attire, understanding that a rival like Sophia respects only the outward projection of absolute authority. Inside the vehicle, Emma exhibits acute stress symptoms, deliberately inflicting pain upon her palms to mask involuntary tremors. Dante identifies her decompensation. He attempts to re-establish control by offering her an exit, adopting a protector persona. Gripped by the profound attachment of Stockholm Syndrome, she rejects the escape, anchoring herself to her dangerous partner. We extract a critical observation here. Willingly marching into psychological destruction alongside a violent figure requires a frightening degree of pathological devotion. Outside, an armed sentry emerges. As the window lowers, Dante projects the vocal modulation of a megalomaniac narcissist, asserting immediate dominance over the perimeter guards. This auditory intimidation grants them access to a fortress designed to dwarf the ego of any visitor. The estate is illuminated with aggressive brilliance, operating as a classic sensory overload tactic. At the summit stands Sophia, projecting immaculate physical control. Her gaze acts as a psychological scalpel, instantly dissecting the micro-expressions of vulnerability in her targets. Her chilling greeting establishes an immediate hierarchy. Let us evaluate this dynamic together. You will find that in any psychological negotiation, the individual who maintains absolute emotional regulation will inevitably dominate the reality of the room. Dante forces the conflict into the verbal arena. Sophia attempts to maintain a flattened affect, yet an ocular microexpression reveals cognitive dissonance. Dante leverages this, exposing his awareness of Vincent's covert manipulation. Redirecting her focus, Sophia fixates on Emma. Dante exhibits an involuntary territorial reflex, placing a hand on Emma's spine while framing her as the center of his instability. Sophia attempts to neutralize Emma by categorizing her as a civilian non-threat. Remarkably, Emma rejects this minimization. Displaying a surge of defensive fortitude, she asserts her own agency. The behavioral evidence points to a fundamental law of human survival. When you allow a dominant personality to dictate your narrative, your individual identity will be permanently erased. Observe the spatial dynamics here. Sophia secures them within an enclosed study, immediately imposing a strict temporal boundary to induce anxiety. She engages in a power display, pouring alcohol exclusively for herself while taking refuge behind a physical barrier. When Dante warns of an impending systemic collapse, Sophia exhibits textbook psychopathic apathy, questioning why the collateral damage should concern her. This highlights a morbid reality of the human condition. Individuals lacking empathy remain indifferent to suffering until the destructive variables directly intersect with their personal assets. Dante responds with a predatory micro-smile. He clinically informs her that all her critical supply chains pass through his volatile sectors. It is a flawless, inescapable cognitive trap. Dante transitions to logical persuasion, quantifying the impending chaos. He argues the structural integrity he maintained for 15 years cannot be replicated by an impulsive successor. Sophia processes the data, acknowledging his assessment, but immediately pivots to exploit his psychological vulnerability. By isolating Emma as the variable that triggered the mutiny, Sophia diagnoses Dante's compromised mental state. Fascinatingly, Emma reinforces her trauma bond, verbally committing to his defense rather than retreating. Sophia clinically observes that this exact emotional enmeshment guarantees his downfall. The psychiatric implication here is profoundly grim. Allowing unregulated emotional attachments to govern your executive functioning will dismantle any structure you have painstakingly built. Stick with me here. We see a fascinating inversion of psychopathology. Sophia asserts empathetic capacity is a terminal liability, yet Dante engages in tactile grounding, gripping Emma's hand to stabilize his nervous system. He reframes his irrational attachment as a superior motivational drive, transitioning from seeking narcissistic supply to defending an object of affection. This prompts a sudden emotional leak from Sophia. She reveals her father's terminal decline. Discarding Dante's sympathetic response as useless data, her father's mortality has shattered her illusions of legacy. We must internalize this clinical reality. Accumulated material power provides zero neurological comfort during the final stages of biological decline. Only genuine human attachment can regulate our terminal terror. Sophia deploys silence to amplify the weight of her admission. She recognizes the profound emptiness of authoritarian control when faced with biological finality. Emma, exhibiting high baseline empathy, offers genuine condolences. Sophia immediately recoils, her defense mechanisms snapping her posture rigid to reject the perceived pity. She analyzes the behavioral patterns of her predecessors, men who exchanged authentic emotional bonds for sociopathic dominance. They expire surrounded by opportunistic predators rather than supportive kin. The psychiatric evaluation remains absolute. The singular pursuit of dominance invariably results in severe emotional isolation. Sophia then pivots, offering her alliance, but behavioral cues suggest a massive transactional contingency. Dante's somatic tension visibly peaks. Now you and I must examine a radical shift in the psychological landscape. Dante demands her parameters, and Sophia issues an astonishing mandate: immediate matrimony. Emma experiences acute hyperventilation, her cognitive processing stalling. Dante's motor control slips as he demands repetition. Sophia's effect remains flat. She is mathematically restructuring their social hierarchy. By elevating Emma to the protected status of a spouse, organizational resentment is neutralized. She transforms from an exploitable weakness into a sanctified structural pillar. It provides a fascinating insight. To survive within a rigid pathological system, one must exploit its archaic traditions to rewrite the power dynamics entirely. Emma's psyche fractures under the pressure. This bond has existed for a mere 96 hours. Dante experiences a collapse of his megalomaniac exterior, vocalizing the irrationality of marrying a stranger. Sophia observes his distress with emotional detachment, viewing the marital contract strictly as collateral for military support. Rejection guarantees her alliance with hostile factions. The silent room amplifies Emma's autonomic arousal. She feels the micro-tremors in Dante's hands. Overwhelmed by his destructive influence, Dante offers her a final psychological exit, plagued by guilt. Yet, exhibiting the terminal phase of Stockholm Syndrome, Emma interrupts his self-flagellation to verify the strategy's efficacy with Sophia. The clinical observation is striking. A formalized commitment frequently serves as the most impenetrable psychological armor in environments defined by absolute chaos. Let us conclude this session. Emma fixates on the narcissist who dismantled her normative reality. Dante engineered a violent systemic collapse simply to preserve her life. Maintaining steady eye contact with her captor, Emma articulates her complete psychological surrender. Dante exhibits acute cognitive dissonance, begging her to escape the codependency he manufactured. The maladaptive bonding is now absolute. Emma's vocal cadence stabilizes, shedding her victimology to consent to the pathological union. Dante attempts to reestablish a boundary, but Emma neutralizes his defenses with devastating reciprocity. It illustrates a dark principle of the human mind. Once a victim fully integrates their identity with a dangerous partner, they will willingly walk directly into the psychological fire. Let us unpack this psychological anomaly together. Once the door shut, Boss suffers an acute collapse of his defense mechanisms. Dante, an apex predator, trembles with unfiltered panic. He holds Emma close, whispering desperate regrets over failing to provide a normal courtship. Clinically, we see his rigid psyche fracturing, yet Emma intercepts this spiral. Displaying symptoms akin to Luca's severe Stockholm Syndrome, she rejects conventional safety. Claiming she desires only his ruined heart, she actively chooses to bond with the monster to survive his brutal environment. This presents a fascinating behavioral truth. Sometimes, deliberately plunging into total darkness is the exact survival tactic the human mind requires when surviving an environment of absolute chaos. A fractured laugh escapes her as she swears to accept his proposal repeatedly. Dante presses his forehead to hers, mourning the normative life he is incapable of providing. Emma, however, demonstrates relentless psychological fortitude. demanding a formal proposal on the spot. A jagged laugh tears from Dante as this underworld kingpin drops to one knee. In my clinical experience, it is exceedingly rare to see a man commanding such terror find genuine psychological salvation in a civilian. He confesses the absurdity of their bond, marveling that it took merely 4 days to dismantle his violent armor. This serves as a compelling lesson in human attachment. Extreme psychological pressure accelerates bonding, proving that profound emotional anchors do not require time to form when two fractured minds inevitably collide. We observe a scene devoid of traditional romantic stimuli. Dante offers a primal blood oath to shield Emma from his own destructive impulses. Emma breathes her surrender, tears spilling as they share a desperate kiss, tasting of whiskey and ruined boundaries. They separate to find his lieutenant Sophia, in the doorway displaying clinical respect. Sophia gives her approval before escalating the timeline, demanding the union occur in 3 days. She immediately dials a deadly rival, using calculated vocal intimidation to declare Emma an untouchable asset within the syndicate. This behavior highlights a brutal psychological reality. Absolute loyalty often demands stepping directly into a hostile environment to establish dominance, accepting that severe collateral damage is simply the necessary cost of long-term security. Sophia executes a flawless display of psychological warfare. By warning their rival Vincent that the syndicate backs Dante, she builds a cognitive wall. Much like the megalomaniac narcissist Vittorio, Vincent targets weakness, which Sophia simply eliminates. The setting shifts to the claustrophobic silence of a black sedan. Emma grips Dante's hand, her pale knuckles indicating severe nervous system arousal. Sensing her panic, Dante offers a final exit strategy, promising to face the impending violence alone if she chooses flight over fight. This illustrates a vital behavioral principle. The healthiest attachments always provide the subject with an open door to escape, even if that departure ensures the absolute emotional destruction of the one who remains. Emma suppresses her biological flight response, leaning into him despite the catastrophic implications of their union. Dante pulls her close, his typically dominant vocal patterns fracturing. He admits his attachment runs deeper than his violent tendencies ever allowed him to predict. Emma issues a high-stakes behavioral challenge, demanding he take her home and validate his claims. He reminds her of their agreement to maintain boundaries. Emma counters that boundaries are obsolete, seeking total enmeshment with his fractured psyche. A primal instinct triggers, and he commands the driver to accelerate. This underscores a fascinating psychological phenomenon. When a subject identifies a stabilizing anchor in a chaotic environment, the brain demands immediate integration, refusing to delay gratification for a hypothetical tomorrow. Let us examine this case file together. The next 72 hours dissolve into a high-stress operational blur. Sophia orchestrates the event like a militaristic defense strategy, leaving Emma to endure the hostile stares of armed syndicate members. Soon, Emma's mother breaches the perimeter, exhibiting raw psychological distress. She questions the sanity of marrying a known predator after a mere 5 days. Emma acknowledges the cognitive dissonance, yet insists Dante provides a profound neurological baseline of peace she desperately needed. You and I have probably analyzed this exact familial conflict before. Relatives will inevitably project their own survival anxieties onto our choices, but the ultimate accountability for our mental equilibrium must always rest squarely on our own shoulders. We observe the mother's distress as she asks if temporary dopamine spikes are worth the statistical probability of a violent death. Emma immediately de-escalates this panic. Demonstrating cognitive clarity, she insists she is entirely secure. Dante exhibits a hyper-vigilant devotion, the exact psychological reinforcement her mother once dismissed as fiction. Emma accepts the environmental risks without delusion. Defeated, her mother initiates a crushing embrace, threatening brutal retaliation if Dante fails her. The ceremony begins with suffocating environmental tension. The Gothic cathedral is populated by armed, antisocial personalities guarding the altar. This clinical observation remains undeniably true. Often, an individual must walk directly into the epicenter of a hostile storm to finally synthesize their own lasting psychological peace. The cathedral is thick with latent aggression. Sophia secures the front row, tracking threats with the precision of a seasoned operative. Emma executes her approach entirely alone, unbothered by her mother's rude refusal to participate in this deviant ritual. Her mind eliminates all external stimuli, focusing entirely on Dante. He monitors her with an intensity suggesting his biological regulation depends on her proximity. The ceremony triggers a mild dissociative state for Emma. She grounds herself using the tactile input of his scarred hands, reducing the efficient to meaningless auditory static. Their kiss completely overrides the surrounding threat matrix. This provides a vital metric for resilience. A true psychological anchor possesses the unique capacity to entirely mute the most traumatic environmental chaos, allowing the subject to breathe. The lens shifts to a reception saturated with covert hostility. Emma interacts with dangerous individuals until her hands exhibit sensory numbness. She maintains a controlled affect, suppressing the intrusive thought that bonding with an apex predator guarantees a violent conclusion. Yet, observing her husband commanding the room, her neurochemistry stabilizes. She perceives only positive reinforcement in his gaze. Clinically, this dynamic is pure, unregulated madness. It carries a high probability of mutual destruction, but extreme psychological rewards frequently require subjecting oneself to severe behavioral risk. Later, the auditory overload ceases. They isolate on a freezing balcony. Dante pulls her close, lowering his tone as he probes to see if she experiences remorse over binding her identity to his pathological reality. Emma surveys the expansive grid of the Chicago skyline, allowing the cognitive shift of her new reality to fully integrate. She turns toward Dante, a ruthless operator who jeopardized his entire syndicate to ensure her survival. Displaying a genuine, unforced expression of joy, she confirms she harbors absolutely zero remorse. This behavioral pivot is staggering. Mere days prior, Emma was an anxiety-ridden civilian, hoping to survive a mundane corporate interaction. Now, she actively rewrites the operational parameters of a criminal empire. This case file highlights a profound lesson in psychological duality. Apex predators are highly capable of seeking moral stabilization, and ordinary individuals often harbor the latent resilience required to wear a heavy crown when extreme environmental pressures demand rapid adaptation. As you and I close out this clinical evaluation together, we observe them in the dark. They are highly aware that the systemic violence remains unresolved. Rival factions will mobilize, and men like Vincent will inevitably attack. Yet, as they maintain eye contact, Emma's autonomic fear response is entirely absent. She has successfully adapted from a traumatized civilian into a highly functional operator, standing seamlessly beside a ruthless kingpin. She recognizes that this hostile environment is precisely where her psychological baseline thrives. This leaves us with a compelling behavioral truth. Sometimes, the most terrifying environmental detours are the exact mechanisms required to force a human mind into its true state of equilibrium. What catastrophic risks are you ultimately willing to tolerate to synthesize your own lasting peace?
By the end of the story, Emma makes a dramatic choice. She chooses Dante, his world, and the uncertain future that comes with him. From the outside, her decision may look reckless. She has known him only a short time. His world is dangerous. His enemies are real. Yet the deeper meaning of her choice is not simply romance. It is about courage, identity, and refusing to live invisibly. Emma has spent much of her life surviving. She works, sacrifices, sends money, and accepts being overlooked. Dante's world is dangerous, but it also forces her to ask who she wants to become. Does she want to keep living only to pay bills and avoid risk, or does she want to choose a life where she feels awake, seen, and important? This does not mean viewers should romanticize danger. The educational message is not choose chaos. The message is that life-changing decisions require awareness. Emma's strongest moment is not when she agrees to marry Dante. It is when she says they must do things together with honesty. She chooses, but she chooses with her eyes open. Many people stay in small, unhappy lives because fear feels safer than change. They avoid risk, avoid love, avoid difficult conversations, and call it peace. But sometimes peace is only numbness. Growth often asks us to step into uncertainty. Emma's story teaches that courage is not the absence of fear. She is afraid many times. But she still speaks, asks questions, sets terms, and claims her place. She stops being invisible because she stops acting like her life belongs only to other people's needs. The final lesson is powerful. A new life is not given to us. It is chosen. And every meaningful choice requires courage, honesty, and the willingness to become more than we were before.